If you just watched the most recent video before this one, you'll note that it talked about the impact of solar radiation, incoming sunlight on climate. But now we're going to talk about some of the other factors that impact climate, especially the geography of the Earth itself. So, the first question we're going to look at is how do bodies of water affect weather and climate? In general, bodies of water tend to stabilize the temperature of any land near them. So, if you've ever lived near a lake or the ocean, you may have noticed that the temperature extremes were not as bad as if you lived inland. So, let's look at two hypothetical regions. Region A has a nearby body of water, could be a lake, could be the ocean. And the relevant thing here is water can absorb and release a lot of heat without changing temperature. So, because of that, notice that the second region, which looks to be in more of a desert region, does not tend to have it doesn't have a body of water there. So notice the daytime temperature there is higher than it is in the coastal area. The coastal area is like a whole 3 degrees Celsius cooler because the water is absorbing that extra heat. Now, this also affects nighttime temperatures because at night, water releases heat back into the atmosphere, which can help keep the temperature of the surrounding land a little warmer. So, notice the nighttime temperature when you have this body of water nearby is higher than the nighttime temperature without this body of water nearby. And if you're like, miss, you're making it up. Well, I'm actually not. So I did have family live in California, and they lived inland of LA. And what I would notice is it was really hot where they lived, but it would be a nice, pretty temperature in LA. And there's a reason for that. So if you look at these two diagrams, I want to point out a couple of things. These are some climatograms, mostly looking at temperature because we're not paying as much attention to rainfall here. And notice the maximum temperature on this graph on the left is 100 degrees, whereas the maximum temperature on this graph on the right is only at 90 degrees. Also notice that the daily highs and the daily lows, there is a much larger distance between those. This span of temperature is looks like it's about 30 degrees on average. Whereas if we look over here, it's about 20 degrees on average. So you're going to have a larger spread in the temperature as well in these two regions. So let's look at where these are on a map. On a map, that red pin is where this climate graph is, and that's San Bernardino, which is inland from LA. Notice it's further inland, it tends to have higher highs and lower lows and a wider range of temperature. But the other area, which is LA, and that's where that temperature data is taken from, notice it's closer to the coast and it tends to have milder weather. It doesn't have as high temperatures and it doesn't have as low temperatures. There's not as wide a spread. So this is that proximity to an ocean that's having an impact. Another thing that can happen when you have land bordering water is a monsoon. And these are seasonal rains that are caused by the fact that land and water heat up and cool down at different rates. So let's look at this diagram right here. We have on the left spring and summer. Since water is going to be able to absorb heat or release heat without changing temperature, it tends to warm up less easily, so it's going to be cooler. Whereas land, if you've ever been out on some rock in the sun, that stuff tends to absorb heat, so this is going to be warm. And if you will remember, when you have warm air, it tends to be low pressure, and when you have cool air, it tends to be high pressure. And air moves from high to low pressure. So moist air is going to be driven towards the land. As it's driven towards the land, especially if there's an increase in elevation, it's warm, moist air rising. So you're going to have condensation, and that's when those monsoon rains come in. Then, as that air rises, it cools and it's going to sink and it tends to flow out back towards the ocean to complete this kind of circle. And then, as it sinks, it's going to become a higher pressure area, which gets driven back onto the land. So, it forms this kind of convection current. This is different from the winter. In the winter, you have the opposite happen. Because the oceans retain heat better, they tend to be the warm area, and the land, since it radiates heat better, tends to be the cool area. So the warm area out in the ocean is low pressure, the cool area over land is high pressure, and air moves from high to low pressure. So it moves from the land out to the ocean. There, it warms up, becomes less dense, rises, and then you have the same old thing where you're going to have precipitation happen because there's condensation going on. But that's happening out over the ocean. Then you're going to have that air that's cool and devoid of moisture, it's already rained everything out, is going to move towards the land where it's going to sink, and as it sinks, it warms up a little, and as it warms up, it absorbs moisture instead of releasing it. Now, monsoons are particularly significant in some parts of the world where they tend to be and in some cases, the sole source of water for agriculture or for human use. So, monsoons are very important. If you have a weak monsoon, then you might be worried about will you be able to grow the crops to feed your family. Mountains are another large geographical feature that can affect weather and climate. So notice the windward side on this diagram and the leeward side because those are going to be important terms that you need to know. So the windward side and the leeward side. Now, as you have air approach mountains, it's going to be pushed upwards in elevation because mountains are tall. Air can't move through them, so it's got to go up over them. Now, if this air happens to have some moisture in it, as it rises and it cools, water's going to condense and you're going to have precipitation. That means that you're going to have on the windward side of mountains any sort of plants that require a lot of precipitation. That's where they're going to be. Then the air is going to cross over the mountains, and as it crosses over, it's going to descend where it's going to warm. Warm air holds more moisture, so you're going to have a higher rate of evaporation than precipitation, and then you tend to see deserts. These desert areas are called rain shadows. So they're areas that have become drier, and they've become drier because these tall mountains are pretty much blocking precipitation. So it's like there's a shadow in of the mountain. In the shadow of the mountain, there is no rain. Is kind of what it I think the terminology came from. So this whole thing is called the rain shadow effect. So we're going to look at an actual map, and this is India, happens to be where my family is from, but that's not relevant to this. This is a satellite image showing you greenery. So this area right here is going to be green and lush, and the reason for that is it's the windward side of the Himalaya mountains. So that's what this kind of cliff looking thing is. That is the Himalaya mountains. And so, as warm air from the ocean goes towards the Himalayas, it gets driven upward, and then you have precipitation. By the time the air makes it over the mountain and gets to the leeward side, you are not going to see very much precipitation. Notice how the land changes from that green that shows there's probably some forest or something to a brown that indicates there's less plant life because it's more of a desert because there is less precipitation. And last but not least, we're going to talk about albedo. Albedo is the reflectivity of a surface. So if you look at this diagram, it shows you the scale on which we measure albedo. If something is pure black, it absorbs all light that hits it, and it's got an albedo of 0. If something is pure white, it reflects all of the light that hits it and it's got an albedo of 1. So we see different surfaces have different albedos. Snow or ice are going to have a high albedo because they're white, they reflect a lot of light. On the other hand, dark soil is going to have a low albedo because it tends to absorb light instead of reflecting it. So things like snow or ice are going to reflect a lot of light. Apparently, if you go skiing, you have to be careful because a lot of the light reflecting off of the snow and ice can cause snow blindness. On the other hand, if you have dark surfaces or water, those tend to absorb light and also absorb heat, which can have a large impact on local climate. And that's it for this lesson. One more lesson will drop probably tomorrow on El Nino and La Nina.